Job chapter 2. I'm going to read verses 11 through 13 from the English Standard Version. It reads like this. Now, when Job's three friends heard of all this evil that had come upon Job, they came each from his own place. Eliphaz, the Temanite, Bildad, the Shuhite, Zophar, the Naamathite. And they made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, when his friends saw Job from a distance, they did not recognize Job. And they raised their voices and wept, and they tore their robes and sprinkled dust on their heads toward heaven. And they sat with Job on the ground for 7 days and for 7 nights. And no one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. No one spoke a word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. The word of the Lord is blessed. You may be seated. Thank you, God, that your word is sweet to my taste, sweeter than honey to my mouth. It's a lamp to my feet and a light to my path. Because the grass withers, the flower fades, but your word remains forever. I would like to title our sermon from these verses in Job chapter 2. I would like to title it, A Real One. A Real One. I'm going to try not to tell you to turn to your neighbor much, but we black, so one thing we do in church is we talk to one another. So would you turn to your neighbor and say, are you a real one? Turn to your other neighbor and act like you black and say like we say, are you a real one? Oh, I forgot. There's some folks that don't look like us in the room. My bad. All right, let me get to my introduction. They get the gift and the beauty of being with us. Thank you for being a friend. Traveled down a road and back again. Your heart is true. You're a pal and a confidant. And if you threw a party, invited everyone you knew, well, you would see the biggest gift would be from me. And the card attached would say, thank you for being a friend. Now, I know I dated myself with that reference. The young people have no idea what we're talking about. Those of you below a certain age, you know nothing of the sense of nostalgia that song conjures up for us. But that was the theme song of a show that we used to watch growing up, children, young people, called The Golden Girls. And while you may not be familiar with the song or the show, I believe the lyrics of that song rings true across generational divide. Because the desire for meaningful friendship, to have a real one in your corner with you, a ride or die, somebody who, as the young people would say, would be 10 toes down for you. It's a shared desire of all of us. It's something that we can all relate to. It's something that we can all identify with. I would even say that it's part of what makes us human. Because when God created mankind, even though everything else he had created he said was good, the first thing that God said was not good was for man to be alone. I say this because if you don't know, loneliness is on the rise, especially post-pandemic, and especially with those who are in the bracket, the age group that is getting older, and in the bracket, especially those in the bracket of the age group that's younger. Those two age groups are getting lonelier. Amen. So much so in May of this year, Vivek Murthy, who is the U.S. Surgeon General, he released an 85-page advisory declaring that loneliness is a new public health epidemic in the United States. In this 85-page document, Dr. Murthy lays out the risk associated with our epidemic of loneliness and isolation. He warns that the physical consequences of poor connections, social connections, it can be devastating, including poor social connections can include a 29% increased risk of heart disease, 32% increased risk of stroke by having poor social connections, 50% increase of risk of developing dementia in older people if you have poor social connections. His report even says that lacking meaningful social connections can increase the risk of premature death to the levels comparable to smoking 15 cigarettes a day. This is what data, research, the health data proves, that loneliness, isolation, it can kill you. It's no wonder to me that the wise sage, Reverend Dr. Gardner C. Taylor, said that friendship is the medicine of life. That's why innately we are all looking for a real one. Even better yet, some of us are looking for some real ones. Real ones like Job's three friends who showed up in Job's time of need after they had heard about everything that Job was going through. But everyone is looking for a real one, but it begs the question, are you a real one? Am I a real one? After these past few weeks, we have been moving on this continuum that began with us dealing with our issues. And God dropped this aspect of what happened to Job in my spirit. And I realized that it was because even though there isn't a lot of attention paid to Job's friends when we talk about Job, the majority of what is written in the account that we have about Job's life, the majority of what is written, it is the back and forth banter that Job has with his friends. He is dealing with this post-traumatic stress of suffering from some extreme loss that he has just experienced. And most of Job's account that we have in Scripture is this conversation that he has with his friends, or perhaps I would even say his so-called friends. Because from chapter 3 to chapter 37, it's just this conversation, this back and forth between Job and his friends. So that means that 34 to 35 of the 42 chapters is this conversation that Job is having with his friends. And so what I realize is that at least one element that we have not touched on over these past few weeks that almost moves alongside of this continuum of dealing with our issues is around how, when we deal with our issues and when we're experiencing difficulty or we're suffering in life, those who are around you can either add to that irritation or help to relieve it. You do know what can make it even more difficult when you're working through your issues or your difficulties or your moments of pain and suffering. You know that the people around you, they can wind up doing more damage than good if you got the wrong folks around you. And before you point the finger at others, I think we all need to do others a service and reflect on how helpful we are. I mean, how helpful are we when someone else is going through a difficult time? I tiptoe lightly because I know that one of the members of our church, a sister and a brother of our church, tomorrow will be an anniversary of when they lost their son. I wonder how hopeful we were during their time of suffering. It's like the young boy Blake Rajan, who, after he had experienced some bullying at school and at just 6 years old, the next year, for the first day of school, he asked his mom, "Mom, will you make me a shirt? And I want the shirt to be bright orange, and I want the letters to be in bright green so that it will stand out." Because he had experienced some bullying the previous year. And so the next school year, for the first day of school, he came to school with a shirt that read, "I will be your friend." Because he knew how important it was to be a friend to someone when they're going through a difficult moment. Oftentimes, it's hard to find that person. So he said, "I'm going to be that person for someone else." See, I sense that we need help in how we help others. Others who are pressing to deal with their issues in a healthy way. Those who are allowing God to work in and through them to not just get healed, but to be made whole and even go beyond being made whole. We need help in helping others. And I believe our passage is intended to help us glean how we can be of help to others when others are hurting and others are working through their issues in a healthy way. How can we be of real good help? Because how Job's friends respond after they hear all of the suffering that Job has gone through, how they respond in this passage, it is very insightful. And I believe that God inspired this text through this writer so that we would be helped as we come alongside those who are hurting. Many people just gloss over this. And they deal with Job's suffering, but they don't realize that what adds on to the agony that Job is already dealing with is his friend's response to his suffering. Now, I realize that not everyone knows what Job experienced and went through. You don't know the depth of the suffering he went through. And if you don't know, it's okay. If you want to, I would encourage you to read chapter 1, 2, and 3 maybe on your own when you get home. And if you want to spend some time drudging through the rest of the book, it's a helpful read. It's a tough read, but it's a helpful read. But I want to let you know how we get here. Because it's a fascinating account, what happens to Job. It's super fascinating. And it's also an account, though, that a lot of people give God a bad rap for. In fact, if we're not careful, we can get tripped up over the fact that God allowed what he allowed to happen to Job. See, for those of you who may not be familiar with Job's account, in chapter 1, it tells us that one day Satan was roaming the earth, going to and fro. And he walked up to God, and God said, "Where have you come from?" Satan said, "I've been roaming to and fro. I've been looking for somebody," basically. And God said to Satan, verse 8 of chapter 1, "Have you considered my servant Job?" Job was a rich man of his time. He had 7 sons, 3 daughters. He had 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 female donkeys. Y'all, he was sitting large. And the enemy, Satan, is walking around and he's trying to find somebody that he can get at. And God says, "Have you considered my servant Job?" He says, "There's none like him in all the earth, a blameless and upright man who fears God and turns away from evil." Then Satan answered the Lord and said, "But does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge around him and his house and all that he has on every side? You have blessed the work of Job's hands. And because you've blessed the work of Job's hands, his possessions have increased in the land." He said, "Job don't fear you for no reason. You've been protecting him." And God says, "Okay." see what will happen if I let you at Job. And so Satan says in verse 11, stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to your face. Verse 12 says, the Lord said to Satan, behold, all that he has is in your hand. Only against him do not stretch out your hand. So here's what happens to Job in one day. He gets a message that his oxen and his donkeys have been killed. Then right after he gets that message, he gets a message that his sheep have been killed. Then after that, he gets a message that his camels have been taken away. All in one day. And if that's not enough, all of his livelihood has been taken away. He gets a message that his sons and daughters were in a house enjoying themselves, and they get killed too. A storm comes, knocks down the house, and kills them. All in one day. And then the chapter ends by saying, in all this, Job did not sin or charge God with wrong. What? But y'all, it gets even crazier. Because after all of that happens to Job in one day, Satan then comes back to God. He comes to God, and God says, where have you come from? He says the same thing. He said, I've been roaming to and from. And then God says to Satan again, have you considered my servant Job? He says, even though you did all that stuff to him, he still holds fast his integrity. Even though you have incited me against him to destroy him without reason, he's still serving me. He has not cursed me yet. And so Satan says, yeah, that might be true. But all that a man has, he will give his life for. But stretch out your hand and touch his bone and his flesh, and he will curse you. And so the Lord said to Satan, okay, he is in your hand. Only spare his life. Chapter 2, verse 7. Put this on the screen for me so people see where I am. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and struck Job with loathsome sores from the sole of his foot to the crown of his head. It was so bad that Job took a piece of broken pottery and he scraped himself with that broken pottery. And the ashes, the dead skin that he scraped off of his body, he sat in those ashes. Yo, this was bad. And then after that, Job's wife comes to him. She says, do you still hold fast your integrity? Curse God and die. He says to her, wife, should we receive good from God and not receive evil? I like how the Christian Standard Bible says, should we receive good from God and not adversity from God? That's a question that we all have to wrestle with. But I want you to see some important things that we need to see here, because we can get tripped up over the fact that God allows this to happen to Job. All of this suffering, all of this difficulty, all of this loss. We can get tripped over it. Because while none of us want to experience this type of suffering, we should be encouraged, though, from some stuff that happens. The first thing that we need to be encouraged is that Satan knew that the reason why Job was blessed was because God had a hedge of protection around Job's life. This means that there were things that Satan was trying to throw at Job, but Satan couldn't get at Job because God had a hedge of protection around Job. See, Job was blessed, and the only reason he was blessed was because God had a hedge of protection around his life. He was blessed, and he was making money. He had all these possessions, but it wasn't because of anything Job was doing right. It was because God had decided to put a hedge of protection around his life. And that should be an encouragement for you and I, that even when we go through difficult moments, we need to thank God for all the moments that he did not let come our way. I serve a God who is able to keep me from dangers seen and unseen. See, the thing is that we think that the reason why we got it going on in our life is because of all the things that we have done. We think because we got this degree and we know these people and we live where we live, and because of all these things that's why we have all this stuff in our life. But this lets us know that the reason why we have what we have is because God has put a hedge of protection around our lives. I don't know about you, but I thank God that he's put a hedge of protection around my life. All the things that God has kept from coming my way that I deserved, that God should have allowed, could have allowed, and had he allowed it, I probably wouldn't be here today. But thanks be to God that he's had a hedge of protection around my life. Anybody else, you're grateful that God has a hedge of protection around your life? You know God kept you from some stuff that other folks, Satan got at them, but God didn't let it come your way. You made it through some stuff that other folks did not make it through because God had a hedge of protection around your life. You made it through an accident that you should have died from. You made it through a loss that you should have died from. You made it through a divorce that you should have lost your mind from. It's because God has had a hedge of protection around your life. We learn that God has been keeping us because God's been protecting us. But we also need to see that Satan was only allowed but so far with Job's life. I love how it says it. The first time Satan comes to Job, comes to God, and God allows him at Job. In verse number 12 of chapter 1, it says, "Behold, all that he has is in your hand, Satan. Only against him do not stretch out your hand." Then in the next chapter, chapter 2, when Satan comes back to God and God lets him at Job, in verse number 6 of chapter 2, it says, "And the Lord said to Satan, Behold, he is in your hand, only spare his life." This means that even when God allows Satan to get at you, Satan can only go but as far as God allows him to go. He can only go as far as God allows. He can't get to the stuff that God says, nah, that's off limit for Job. That's off limit for you. That's off limit for my daughter. That's off limit for my son. See, you can take this away from them and you can take that away from them, but you can't take this. It lets us know that even though Satan is permitted some things, he is not given full permission over Job's life. Satan was limited by what he could do because of what God permitted Satan to do. It's like God has the enemy on a leash. And whenever he goes too far, God is able to pull him back in. See, I want to help your theology because a lot of people think when you think of Satan, you think him as an equal of God. You think that him and God are in a boxing match and you don't know who's going to win. No, that's not how it works. See, God is all-knowing and God is all-powerful. And while Satan does have some knowledge and while he has some power, he does not have all knowledge and he does not have all power. And so that means that his power, his knowledge is limited. And God will only permit him to do what he is limited to do. Martin Luther, the great reformer, he says that even the devil is God's devil because he can only do as much as God allows him to do. And so even though we look at suffering around this world, we need to know that this world should be worse off than it is right now. But God is holding Satan on a leash. And one day, soon, Jesus is coming back and he's going to take Satan all the way back and throw him in the pit of hell where he came from. Because God is the only one that has all power. We should respect the devil's power and not take it lightly, not trivialize over it. But we need to know that Satan does not have but limited power. Woo! I thank that God that I serve a God who has all power. I got to quickly move on. We see that God had a hedge of protection around Job. We also see that God had a leash on Satan. But we also see that God knew that Job didn't just fear God because God was protecting Job and God was blessing Job. That's what Satan tries to accuse Job of. In chapter 1, verse 9, he says, does Job fear God for no reason? Have you not put a hedge of protection around him? You've blessed the work of his hands, and as a result, his possessions have increased in the land, but you stretch out your hand and touch all that he has, and he will curse you to his face. And God knew that if he let Satan at Job, Job was going to be strong enough to resist cursing God for himself. Listen, God said to Satan, have you considered my servant Job? Y'all, I know this might sound crazy, but can you imagine having such favor with God in his eyes that he can say, you can get at my servant and I know that they will still trust me? Whew. Listen, I shudder to even say this, but I think sometimes I'd want to be one that God would say, have you considered? Because that makes me know what God thinks of me. And if you're going through a difficult moment right now, I just want to encourage you and let you know that God thinks a lot of you. If he knows that he can send Satan your way such that he can be confident that when he sends Satan your way, you're going to shut the mouth of Satan by being steadfast in who you know God is. You know, that's what happens to Job. Job shuts Satan's mouth. He says, not today, Satan. Because I don't just trust God for the things he gives me. I trust God because I know he is God. When Satan comes Job's way, Job is able to shut Satan up with the very thing that Satan was trying to use to shut God up. That's the kind of God that we serve. And I want it to be the witness of you and I, that God can count us so faithful that he knows he can send Satan our way and we will shut him up. That's what James 5:11 says. It says, you remember the steadfastness of Job. And that steadfastness is the same word that we see in the beginning of James chapter 1, verse 3. Count it all joy when you experience trials of every kind, because you know that those things lead to steadfastness. Job would eventually come out and he would say, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. See, the enemy thought that if he would get at Job, that Job would stop trusting God. But the enemy got to Job, and he found that he ain't going to stop trusting God. And then he went back to God, and he went back to Job, and Job still proved him wrong. See, as we wrestle with why God would allow this, I want to give you at least three things. I cannot seal tight the idea of why God allows suffering in our life. But I can tell you this, that with Job's account, we can see that God allowed it to happen because God knew it would become clear that Job's steadfastness wasn't because of the hedge of protection around Job. Job would say, even though you take all that stuff away from me, I'm still going to trust you. But also God knew that Job would come out on the other side of it stronger than he was before he went into it. This is what Job says in Job chapter 23, verse 10. Job says, God knew the way that I would take, and that when he had tried me, that I would come out forth as pure gold. See, Job went into it and he still had some stuff that he needed to get rid of. And God used that refining of suffering in order to get rid of the stuff that was not pure gold. But Job went through it and he remained steadfast and he came out as pure gold. Lisa Phil says it this way: a faith that can't be tested can't be trusted. And how will we ever know the true measure and purity of our faith if it is never tested? Andre Crouch says it best. He says, I've had many tears and sorrows. I've had questions for tomorrow. And there have been times I didn't know right from wrong. But in every situation, God gave me blessed consolation that my trials only come to make me strong. He says, I've been in a lot of places, I've seen a million faces, and there were times that I felt all alone, but in my lonely hour, yet those were the precious lonely hours where Jesus lets me know that I was his own. And that's why I can say, through it all, I've learned to trust in Jesus. Through it all, I've learned to trust in God. Through it all, I've learned to depend on his word. He says this: so I thank God for the mountains, and I thank him for the valleys. And I thank him for the storms that he's brought me through. For if I never had a problem, I never know God could solve them. I never know what faith in his word could do. See, God knew that he could let Satan at Job because God knew that on the other side of it, Job would come out as pure gold. But God also knew something else. God knew that the trials that Job was about to face would push Job to see God more vividly. Job's trials drew Job closer to God, to experience God in a way that he would never have known or seen before his trials. Don't take my word for it. Take God's word for it. Listen to what Job chapter 42 verse 5 says. Job says, I had heard of you, God, by the hearing of the ear, but now my eye sees you. Job is saying, I had heard about God. I thought I knew about God. I thought I had a close relationship with God. But now that I've been through what I've been through, I really have seen what God is really like. Because when God takes everything away, I realize that he is everything and all I would ever need. I got to move on quickly. So I had to tell you about Job's account. And I'm going to quickly give you what we glean from Job's friends to help us in moments when someone else is suffering, someone else is going through a moment of difficulty. How can we be of most help? It says in verse 11, now Job's 3 friends heard of all this evil that had come upon him, and they came each from his own place. They made an appointment together to come to show him sympathy and comfort him. The first thing that we glean from Job's friends is that when someone is going through a difficult moment, we need to show up. Show up. Make an appointment. Carve out time. You know what our most precious commodity is these days? It is not money, it's time. Carve out time to show up for someone in their time of need. When somebody is suffering, perhaps the most that they need is just your presence. They showed up and they sat with Job in his dead skin. They not only sat in the ashes, but they started to sob and weep and cry with Job. They demonstrated what we hear in the New Testament, what it says in Romans, to mourn with those who mourn. They showed up like Jesus shows up at Lazarus' tomb. Jesus showed up at Lazarus' tomb, and Lazarus had been dead for 4 days. And before he goes in to resurrect Lazarus, you know what Jesus does? Come on, y'all should know it. It's the shortest verse in the Bible. Whenever anybody asks for a Bible verse, you say it. Jesus wept. Because what many people need in their moment of suffering is for you to weep with them. It's for you to sit with them. It's for you to just hold their hand and really not even say much. I have fallen in love with this verse Perhaps because growing up, my dad, he taught me early on as I was pastoring that one of the best gifts that you can give someone is the gift of presence. In 2 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 6, Paul says that God, the one who comforts the downcast, he comforted us by the arrival of Titus. This means that God can send a person to you to comfort you. And just by their mere presence, it can comfort you. You could be the ministry that somebody needs when they are going through just by showing up. But not only do they show up, but when they get there, they shut up. Now, my kids are in the room, so I'm sorry, y'all, because they know that that's not words that we use around our house, but it's good for preaching right now. They don't just show up, but they shut up. I'll say it this way for the young folks. They say less. They find out what Job has gone through, and they're like, say less, we on our way. And when we get there, it's not going to be about what we say. It's about us just being there with you. So often we get into trouble because we just feel like we gotta say something. We're so uncomfortable with silence. We're so uncomfortable with waiting. But sometimes in those moments, you know what is most needed? Just to be quiet. That's why I believe that James tells us to be quick to listen and slow to speak. But so often we are slow to listen and quick to speak. Matter of fact, listen to what his friend Eliphaz says in chapter 4, verse 2. After they sat in silence with Job, they did good, and they should have stopped at chapter 2. Because Job starts speaking, and then chapter 4, verse 2, it says, if one would venture a word with you, Job, will you be impatient? Come on, Job, I got to say something. He says, yet who can keep from speaking? I mean, Job, we're looking at your situation, and we got to say something. And you know that's where many of us go wrong. We feel like we got to have something to say. We feel like we've got to figure out how to make sense of the situation for that person. Matter of fact, one of his other friends, they try to say, Job, the reason why this is happening in your life is because you must have done something that you should not have done. You must have sinned. You must have lived unrighteous. I know that they say that you lived a righteous life, but Job, you need this look. You must have done something wrong. They just needed to shut up. Ephesians 4, verse 29 tells us to let no corrupting talk come out of our mouths, but only such as good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. I've given this to you all before, but I'm going to give it to you again. That verse admonishes us to say the right words in the right way at the right time for the right reasons. Say the right words in the right way. People say, oh, I'm just direct. I just get straight to the point. That means that you don't care about how the receiver is going to receive what you got to say. You're more concerned about what you want to say than it is how they want to receive it. But you got to say the right words. Even if it's true, you got to say it the right way. You got to have the right tone. And you need to wait for the right time. Lady Key and I, we were at the Courageous Conversations yesterday, and man, we heard of I gotta hurry up. We heard of Pastor Freddie Haynes' story. I had never heard this part of his story before, but he said that when he was, actually, let me not tell this story, I'm gonna tell this other story. So Otis Moss, he talked about how his father was a pastor, and he talked about how his sister took her own life. And he said that one of the members of the church came up to him and said, you know your sister's not in heaven, she's in hell. Right after she committed suicide. Like, that is the type of stuff that we need to just shut up. We think we know everything. No, we don't know everything that there is to know. We have to be more gentle with our words, because like somebody said, I heard, your words have the opportunity to pinch someone's heart. say the right words in the right way at the right time and for the right reasons. Because sometimes we don't know what to say out of our mouths. But then the last thing is that we don't, what this passage I believe helps us to glean, is that we don't always know the reasons why people are going through what they're going through. So don't assume. You do know what happens when you assume. By that laugh, I know that you know, so I don't need to go any further. No, I ain't gonna tell us, don't do that. Get behind me, Satan. Not today, Satan. It's when Job's friends tried to act like they knew why things were going the way that they were for Job that they went astray. They tried to say, Job, you must have done something. And we need to be so slow to assume anything. In fact, in those moments, if you're going to say anything, what you probably should say is, how can I be of help to you? How can I be of service to you? Or as I heard someone say, if they're really going through, and sometimes, and here's the thing, is it's a case-by-case basis, because sometimes people need you to talk to them. They need you to help get them out of that funk, and so it's a case-by-case basis. But a lot of times, really, if they're really suffering, matter of fact, that's what it says at the end of chapter 2. They spoke no word to him, for they saw that his suffering was very great. When you know someone's suffering is very great, you don't need to say nothing. But if you're going to say something, you can ask them this question. John O said that there are 3 magic words. Help me understand. Help me understand what you're feeling. Help me understand what you're going through. And then maybe you can say it back to them. But you're just there to help them, to help emote with them, not to give them all of the answers all the time, because you don't know why. Job's difficulty was not because of any evil that Job had done. Matter of fact, Job's difficulties came because he loved God, and God knew that Job would not forsake him. Job says in chapter 13, verse 5, oh, that you would keep silent. It would have been your wisdom to just keep silent. And in chapter 16, verse 2, he says to them, miserable comforters are you all. Listening, y'all, is a form of love. Being willing to listen. Job was sitting in his ashes in the complexity and difficulty of his issues. And his friends showed up to sit with him. It was like Lady Key shared with me, a sister of the church going through a difficult moment just this past week. And they were on the phone together and processing this moment. And she said, in the moment, I knew I didn't need to say anything but just cry with her. Sometimes that's what we need, y'all. Just to let someone cry. And see how you can help serve. I think that this Job's account, it points to something that Jesus talks about over the New Testament. In the New Testament, Jesus talks about this man who comes up to him and he asks him, what do I need to be saved? What do I need to go to heaven? And Jesus tells him these things that he needs to do. And he says, yeah, I've done all those things. And then Jesus says to him, well, love your neighbor as yourself. And the guy says back to him, well, who is my neighbor? And Jesus starts to tell this story about this man who got robbed on his way down to Samaria, and on his way on the Jericho road, and he got robbed. And as he got robbed, it was so bad he was sitting off on the side in a ditch. He was just all mangled, just beat up. And 3 people, church folks, walked by him and didn't do anything about it. But the person who you at least expected, a Samaritan was what they were called at that time, they stopped, bandaged up his wounds, put him in a hotel, and said, whatever cost you incur, put it on my tab, and I'm going to be back to help this person out. Because Jesus was trying to get this man to understand that it's not so important about who your neighbor is, but it's about who are you going to be a neighbor to. And that's where I think that we need to be. Who will we be a neighbor to? You do know that we see this best in Jesus himself. Jesus left all of his glory in heaven to come down to bandage up our wounds by taking wounds in his hands. He was the one who said, not just, oh God, though he slay me, yet will I trust him. He says, my God, why have you forsaken me? He was forsaken so that we never would be forsaken. Here's what's interesting about Job's story. If you turn over to chapter 42, it ends with God telling Job, your friends are messed up. But he says, if you'll pray for them, I'll forgive them. And verse 10 of chapter 42 says, the Lord restored the fortunes of Job when he had prayed for his friends. See, that's how Job's story ends, in case you don't know. God gave Job twice as much as he had before. Verse 12 said, the Lord blessed the latter days of Job more than his beginning, because that's what God can do. God can turn it around. God can make a way. God can provide for you when you have lost everything. Matter of fact, is there anybody in the room that knows that that's the kind of God that we serve? But Job prayed for his friends. See, sometimes that's what we even have to do. That even when our friends don't treat us right, that we can love our friends even when they don't treat us right. Because that's what Jesus, matter of fact, Jesus is the true and better Job. He's the one who was truly innocent, who was truly righteous, who had no sin. And he gives his life so that we would be saved. He gives his life so that we would have eternal life. He gives his life so that now we would see in him that we have salvation through him, but we also have an example of him to do for others like he has done for us. Listen, this passage helps us. Because when people are going through difficult moments, and I know there's some people that are sitting in the room right now, you are going through a moment right now. So somebody in this room, you need to be a friend to them. You need to be a neighbor to them. You need to go sit with them. You need to go, don't say much, say less. Be slow to speak and quick to listen. Don't assume you know everything there is to know. Hold their hand, hug them, weep with them. Sometimes that's the best balm that you can give anyone. And indeed, that's what Jesus has done for us. Every head bowed, every eye closed.